onto the send and return configuration. And with send and return configuration, it's almost identical to what we just did with parallel, with a couple of exceptions. The first exception is you don't actually have to duplicate the track. That's the reason for having the return track. It's able to take audio signals from any other track that you have, which is the second difference. Instead of only being able to send one particular track, a duplication of that track, through a variety of processors, we can send multiple tracks through the same set of processing and then set the relative balance of how much we want going in. So this is easier explained by example than with words, and let's just get into it. And what I've done is I took the two processors from before on the parallel, haven't adjusted them at all, and I've now brought them onto this crush track. So if you think about that a little bit, you're going to notice and become aware of one kind of big issue that's going to present itself here. So let's start going in here to the return. And remember, in your program, it might be called something different. In this program, it's called an effect track. But typically, if you search send and return in your manual, it will come up. And I'm just going to start to feed some of the drum loop into this crush. So here's the drum loop, sending it in. We're seeing some signal. But we're running into a problem, okay? If I've brought this up even just to -16, and I now check and see what's happening inside of the processor, this compressor isn't doing anything. And that's because we're not sending as much signal as we had sent before, meaning that when we duplicated this, we were sending in a lot more signal. Now we're sending in just a balance. So we're going to have to readjust our settings here. So as I'm playing this back, let's go ahead and do that. Start to get some actual gain reduction. Let's check and see what's happening in the loud max. We're getting nothing again. I'm actually going to drive it harder. Okay, so we're getting some distortion here, but we're technically not distorting on either of these tracks. This is coming out at 0 because this loud max here is pushed all the way to 0. Let's push this down to like -5 or so we don't have to drive this in as hard. There we go, that's good. And now to set the relative balance, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the crush, I'm going to bring it down and slowly start to bring some of that in. And you can hear the kind of difference that makes. Now, if we wanted, we could also send in, let's say, some of a vocal, for example. So I'm going to bring in this vocal part here.
Won't you hear my call?
And let's start sending that in.
Won't you hear my call? Won't you hear my call? Won't you hear my call?
Actually, I want these drums to be louder.
Won't you hear my call?
So let's go ahead and check out and see if this vocal is actually doing anything with the compressor and with the loud max. I'm going to take a reference here of what this is. It's about -16, and let's see what the vocal is doing.
Won't you hear my call? Won't you hear my call? Won't you hear my call?
So we're really getting more of the compressor and not really any of the loud max. And that's because this is a kind of very dynamic passage here. Maybe we're getting a little hit happening at this point, but not a whole lot more than that. I'll send it in just a little bit more.
Won't you hear my call? Won't you hear my call?
And also, just as an FYI, you can choose the amount that you send in from the track as well. That's almost always a feature that you're going to see. Or if we're on the mix view, you can see that we're getting the option to do it right here as well. So a variety of places where you can choose how the sound is coming in.
Won't you hear my call? 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 Won't you hear my call?
So there you go, pretty straightforward. If you'll notice, there is an option here to choose how we want the signal to come into the send and return track. And this is really important. So if you notice, we have auto, pre, and post. When it's set to auto, it's always going to be going in post fader, which means if I turn, for example, this drum loop way down, and let's just go ahead and leave this at -16. Let's turn off the vocals for now. I want you to watch and see what happens here to the amount of compression that's happening when I turn this down, okay? So I'm just going to go in here, and I'm going to choose post for right now, so you know for sure. And let's go ahead and mess around with this a little bit. Okay, so you can see the amount of compression. Won't you hear my call? And now nothing is happening. And that's because this fader here is relative to what's being done with the actual fader up here. Now, if I go to pre, you're going to see that we're going to get some compression no matter what. So I'm going to change this to pre now. We're going to go back to the crush. Won't you hear my call? And we're getting heavy compression, and this is because it's actually just responding to whatever you have in your signal flow here. So you can see the level that's coming out here relative to the level here. When we're on pre, it's responding to the level here or whatever the last thing is in your chain going across, which is why we're starting to get some of that coming in, which in this example is why if I'm working with a drum loop, for example, I'm going to probably be setting it to pre just because it's a little bit easier to get what I want. Won't you hear my call? Won't you hear my call? Won't you hear my call? And you can choose for everything that you're sending in whether or not you want it to be pre or post. So we'll leave the vocal on post, leave that on pre. Let's do one more example, which is the classic example. We're going to set up another return track, and this is just going to be a basic reverb here. So I'm going to go in and I'm going to grab a reverb plugin. We'll go with something familiar that we've seen before. We'll use the tall reverb. And what I'm going to do in this instance is I'm going to set the whole thing wet. And this is kind of why they call it an effect track here. If I send in dry, what's really the point other than just making it louder? Because it's going to be giving me part of that balance in this plugin of the dry signal. All I want is wet because all I want is the reverb, and then I'm going to balance that accordingly with these tracks. Just like with the crush, there's no reason for me to send something into the crush if it's not actually getting processed. Same idea with the reverb. There's no reason for me to send it in and get dry signal coming out of it because it's an effect, right? If we wanted a balance, we would set that balance on the individual track itself. So let's go in here now. We're going to add in this little cymbal roll, and we're going to give everything some reverb. Won't you hear my call? 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 Kind of like a lot there on the cymbal. And then just a touch on the drums. So with no reverb. Won't you hear my call? Won't you hear my call? And that's the idea with the send and return tracks. Not very different than parallel, with the exception that you can send multiple things in and you don't actually have to go about and duplicate the tracks. So useful. This has been around since the early days of mixing consoles, and it continues to be used every single day in the digital audio workstation as well.